Chapter 14, Integrating the Lesson, Recognizing Recurring Patterns. A lesson is not truly integrated merely because it has been intellectually understood. Consciousness can understand an idea long before it has incorporated the reality behind that idea. A person may know that attachment creates suffering while continuing to become attached. They may understand that fear distorts perception while repeatedly allowing fear to determine their actions. They may recognize a recurring relationship pattern while continuing to recreate the same dynamic. They may know that resistance intensifies friction while spending years resisting the very circumstances that repeatedly confront them. This distinction between knowing and integrating is essential. Knowledge belongs primarily to the level of information. Integration belongs to the structure of consciousness itself. A lesson becomes integrated when it begins changing the way consciousness naturally perceives, interprets, and responds to experience. This is why recurring patterns are so important. A recurring pattern is not necessarily evidence that the universe is punishing an individual. It may instead indicate that something within the consciousness has not yet been fully understood. The same type of experience appears. The same emotional reaction emerges. The same expectation is formed. The same type of conflict develops. The same consequence follows. Then, perhaps after a period of reflection, the pattern appears again. From the perspective of victim consciousness, this can feel like persecution. Why does this keep happening to me? But from the perspective of the curriculum, repetition has another meaning. The lesson has not yet been completed. The purpose of repetition is not necessarily to punish. It is to provide another opportunity for recognition. Reality presents the pattern again because the consciousness encountering it is still structured in a way that produces or sustains the same relationship with it. The pattern therefore becomes a mirror, not a mirror that tells us that everything is our fault, but a mirror that reveals the structure through which we are participating in experience. This distinction is critical. Suppose an individual repeatedly encounters betrayal. The simplistic karmic interpretation might say, "You caused this." That is unnecessary. The more useful inquiry is, what relationship with trust, discernment, attachment, expectation, or boundaries repeatedly places this consciousness into the same field of experience? The question becomes observational rather than accusatory. Likewise, someone who repeatedly encounters conflict may discover that the recurring lesson is not that the world is hostile. It may concern perception. Perhaps they interpret disagreement as rejection. Perhaps they defend themselves before understanding what has actually occurred. Perhaps their identity depends upon being right. Perhaps they continually enter environments that reproduce a familiar form of struggle. The recurring experience provides information. Once the pattern is seen clearly, it becomes possible to participate differently. This is where karmic development begins to accelerate. A pattern that remains unconscious must express itself through behavior. A pattern that becomes conscious can be observed. A pattern that can be observed can be understood. A pattern that is understood can be transformed. The movement is therefore repetition, recognition, understanding, integration, transformation. This is one of the fundamental pathways through which the curriculum operates. The individual does not graduate by avoiding every difficult experience. They graduate by no longer requiring the same experience to produce the same understanding. Eventually, what once produced intense reaction produces recognition instead. The event may still occur, but consciousness has changed. The same circumstance enters a different field. This is an important sign of development. The question is not, has the world stopped giving me difficult experiences? The deeper question is, do difficult experiences still produce the same consciousness in me? If the answer is no, then something fundamental has changed. The lesson has begun to integrate. Expanding perception. Integration naturally leads to expansion of perception. When consciousness is caught inside a narrow perceptual structure, experience appears simple. Something happens. A reaction follows. The reaction feels justified. The explanation seems obvious. The individual sees one cause, one meaning, and one possible response. As perception expands, additional dimensions become visible. The event remains the event, but its meaning becomes more complex. A person begins seeing causes behind causes. They recognize that behavior emerges from conditions. They see that their own reactions have histories. They notice how expectation shapes perception. They recognize how fear selects certain interpretations while excluding others. They begin distinguishing what actually happened from what the mind added to what happened. This is a major stage of spiritual development. The expansion of consciousness is not necessarily the acquisition of more beliefs. It is the acquisition of more perceptual capacity. The world becomes larger because consciousness is capable of seeing more of it. This is why the perceptual guardrails described earlier are so important. Consciousness does not ordinarily perceive reality in its totality. It encounters reality through a particular configuration. The senses provide one layer, the mind provides another, memory provides another, cultural conditioning provides another, personal history provides another, karmic impressions provide another. The result is not necessarily false perception, it is partial perception. This distinction matters. A partial view can be accurate while still being incomplete. A person looking through a window may correctly describe everything visible through that window while remaining unaware of what exists beyond it. Spiritual expansion therefore involves progressively widening the window. What was once interpreted as an isolated event becomes part of a pattern. What appeared personal becomes structural. What appeared random becomes intelligible. What appeared external becomes relational. What appeared to be an enemy becomes part of a larger system of interaction. This does not mean every event must be assigned a mystical explanation. It means consciousness becomes increasingly capable of holding multiple layers of causation without prematurely reducing experience to a single explanation. This is a form of inner spaciousness. The consciousness that previously required certainty begins tolerating inquiry. The consciousness that previously required an enemy begins examining function. The consciousness that previously required control begins developing discernment. The consciousness that previously reacted immediately begins observing first. And this expansion changes the curriculum itself. When perception expands, previously inaccessible possibilities become visible. When possibilities become visible, new responses become available. When new responses become available, behavior changes. When behavior changes, consequences change. When consequences change, the surrounding field of experience changes. The transformation therefore begins internally, but does not remain internal. A change in consciousness changes the manner in which consciousness participates in reality. This is why awakening cannot be reduced to acquiring extraordinary experiences. Visions, energetic phenomena, altered states, mystical experiences, and unusual perceptions may occur, but none of these necessarily demonstrate integration. The more important question is, has consciousness become capable of seeing more clearly? Can it perceive without immediately projecting? Can it experience without immediately identifying? Can it distinguish fear from intuition? Can it distinguish attachment from love? Can it distinguish resistance from discernment? Can it distinguish genuine limitation from limitation created by its own assumptions? These distinctions represent expansion. The mind becomes less crowded with conclusions and more capable of seeing relationships. The field of awareness widens, and as it widens, the curriculum becomes increasingly transparent. Dissolving karmic friction. Karmic friction can be understood as the resistance generated when the existing structure of consciousness encounters circumstances that expose its limitations. Friction does not necessarily mean that something has gone wrong. In fact, friction can be one of the clearest indicators that development is occurring. A wheel only reveals resistance when it encounters the ground. Likewise, consciousness reveals its unresolved structures through contact with experience. Attachment produces friction when circumstances change. Fear produces friction when uncertainty appears. Pride produces friction when the self-image is challenged. Ignorance produces friction when reality contradicts expectation. Control produces friction when events refuse to obey intention. Identification produces friction whenever something threatens the identity being defended. The friction itself is not necessarily the problem. Identification with the friction is. A person experiences anger and concludes, I am angry. A person experiences fear and concludes, I am afraid. A person experiences rejection and concludes, I have been rejected. A person experiences limitation and concludes, I am trapped. In each case, an experience becomes an identity. The experience is temporary. The identification gives it continuity. This is one mechanism through which karmic patterns persist. The event arises. Consciousness identifies with it. Identification produces reaction. Reaction produces further consequences. Those consequences reinforce the original interpretation. The pattern becomes self-sustaining. Dissolution begins when consciousness interrupts this cycle, not by suppressing the experience, not by pretending that the experience does not matter, not by forcing oneself to be spiritually positive, but by seeing the experience clearly. Anger can be experienced without becoming identity. Fear can be experienced without becoming prophecy. Grief can be experienced without becoming permanent self-definition. Desire can be experienced without becoming command. Pain can be experienced without becoming a complete explanation of reality. This is where detachment becomes powerful. Detachment does not mean indifference. It means allowing experience to exist without allowing it to completely define consciousness. In the Indic traditions, this movement is closely related to the loosening of identification with the modifications of mind. The experience arises. It is witnessed. It is understood. Its causes and conditions become clearer. The consciousness no longer needs to become the experience. As identification weakens, friction decreases. This is the dissolution of karma at the level of consciousness. The external event may not immediately disappear, but its capacity to bind consciousness changes. The same circumstance that once produced prolonged resentment may now produce brief recognition. The same temptation that once controlled behavior may now be observed without compulsion. The same criticism that once destabilized identity may now be received as information. The same uncertainty that once produced fear may now be met with patience. The external world has not necessarily changed. The relationship between consciousness and the world has changed. That is the deeper meaning of karmic dissolution. Karma does not necessarily need to be imagined as an invisible collection of punishments waiting to be exhausted. It can be understood as the persistence of conditioned interaction. When the conditioning changes, the interaction changes. When the interaction changes, the pattern loses its fuel. Eventually, what once required repeated external circumstances can be understood internally. The lesson no longer needs to be demonstrated through the same intensity of experience. The friction has served its function. This is why spiritual development is not simply the accumulation of merit. It is the removal of unnecessary resistance, less identification, less compulsion, less projection, less unconscious repetition, less resistance to what is, more clarity, more discernment, more capacity, more conscious participation. The karmic structure becomes lighter, not because consciousness has escaped the laws of reality, but because it has become increasingly compatible with them. Conscious participation in development. At the beginning of the curriculum, consciousness largely experiences itself as something that happens to. Life occurs, circumstances arise, people enter and leave, events unfold, emotions appear, desires emerge. The individual responds. There may be little recognition of the deeper structure connecting these experiences. Development begins when consciousness becomes aware that it is participating in the process. This is the transition from unconscious development to conscious development. The curriculum continues either way. The difference is the degree of participation. A lesson can be learned through repeated suffering. It can also be learned through observation. A pattern can be broken through exhaustion. It can also be broken through understanding. A limitation can disappear after years of struggle. It can also dissolve when consciousness finally understands why it existed. The second pathway is not necessarily easier. It is simply more conscious. Conscious participation begins with a willingness to observe experience without immediately demanding that it conform to expectation. Instead of asking only whether an experience is pleasant or unpleasant, consciousness begins asking whether it is revealing something. Instead of asking whether an event is fair, consciousness begins asking what it is showing. Instead of asking whether a person is good or bad, consciousness begins examining the interaction itself. Instead of asking whether the universe is helping or attacking, consciousness begins looking for correspondence. This creates a different relationship with life. Experience becomes instructional. not because every event contains an obvious symbolic message. Rather, every experience provides an opportunity to observe the relationship between consciousness and reality. That relationship is the actual curriculum. A conscious participant therefore begins taking responsibility for attention. What is being noticed? What is being ignored? What assumptions are operating? What emotional pattern has appeared? What expectation has been violated? What attachment is being defended? What capacity is missing? What would a more expanded consciousness perceive here? These questions turn ordinary life into a field of practice. The spiritual path no longer exists only during meditation, ritual, prayer, study, pilgrimage, or mystical experience. The entire field of experience becomes relevant. A conversation becomes practice. Conflict becomes practice. Solitude becomes practice. Success becomes practice. Failure becomes practice. Uncertainty becomes practice. Even boredom becomes practice. Every circumstance provides an opportunity to observe consciousness operating within its present structure. This is the beginning of conscious evolution. The individual stops waiting for enlightenment to arrive as an external event. Instead, development becomes something participated in moment by moment. This does not mean forcing growth. Growth has its own timing. A seed cannot be pulled upward by the stem. Likewise, consciousness cannot be forced into a developmental stage for which it lacks the necessary foundation. But consciousness can become receptive. It can observe, it can inquire, it can practice discernment, it can stop reinforcing patterns that it has already recognized. It can create conditions in which deeper understanding becomes possible. This is conscious participation, and it introduces a subtle transformation in the meaning of destiny. Destiny no longer needs to mean passive submission to an unchangeable script, nor does it need to mean absolute personal control. The curriculum may establish the field. Consciousness develops within that field. As consciousness develops, its capacity changes. As capacity changes, the manner of participation changes. Thus, the unfolding remains lawful while becoming increasingly conscious. This is perhaps the central paradox of spiritual maturation. The more deeply consciousness understands the lawfulness of reality, the more intelligently it can participate within that lawfulness. Freedom does not require escaping the structure. It emerges through understanding the structure. A musician becomes freer through mastering musical law. A yogin becomes freer through understanding the movements of mind. A seeker becomes freer through recognizing the patterns through which identification binds awareness. In each case, mastery does not come from abolishing structure. It comes from understanding structure so completely that unconscious limitation gives way to conscious participation. This is the movement toward graduation. The student does not graduate because the curriculum was defeated. The student graduates because the curriculum has been integrated. The recurring pattern is recognized. Perception expands. Karmic friction dissolves. Participation becomes conscious. And with each of these developments, less of reality needs to be experienced as an obstacle. The consciousness that once asked, "Why is this happening to me?" begins asking, "What is this revealing?" The consciousness that once asked, "How do I escape?" begins asking, "What must be understood?" And eventually, perhaps the distinction between the lesson and the life begins to disappear. There is no longer a separate spiritual curriculum imposed upon existence. Existence itself has become the curriculum. Every encounter becomes an opportunity for consciousness to know itself more completely. Every limitation reveals the edge of present capacity. Every friction reveals where identification remains. Every recurring pattern points toward unfinished understanding. Every expansion opens a larger field of participation. The purpose of integration is therefore not to become someone entirely different. It is to remove what prevents consciousness from expressing what it already has the capacity to become. The lesson is integrated when it no longer needs to repeat itself in the same way. The boundary dissolves when the capacity that required it has expanded, and consciousness moves forward not by fleeing the field of experience, but by becoming increasingly capable of meeting that field without distortion. This is graduation in its deepest sense. Not escape, not conquest, not rebellion against the architecture of existence, understanding, integration, expansion, and finally, conscious participation in the unfolding of consciousness itself.